of the session, and we'll take just a minute here and do a housekeeping thing. So the first one is that if you are not talking, if you could mute your microphone, that would be really wonderful. Helps a lot to minimize background noise, which I hear a little bit of at the moment. So if you could double check your mics, that would be super. Please do feel free to ask questions and add your thoughts and ideas as we move forward through the seminar. We've got two really exciting presentations today. And if you're having trouble with your mic or feel you can't get a word in edgewise, feel free to add it in the chat box as well, and we'll make sure that if we don't answer it during the seminar today, we'll get back to you afterwards by email. Feel free to email Jonathan Wilkins, who's our IT person, if you can't get something figured out and you're not able to get my attention, and we'll try to figure it out as quickly as possible. And finally, we will record this seminar and put it unlisted on YouTube, but the link will be sent out to the same list that got the invitation to the webinar. So for folks who, I know we've got a number of people who are traveling and in other meetings and looking forward to catching up with the recording later. So that is available as well. So today, the two sessions are, first of all, a partner organization of ours that we've been in touch with for several years, has been doing some really exciting work, a number of different projects related to conservation, the Forest Trust, and they'll be talking today specifically about their Rurality program in their office in Ghana, but they will be giving us a little bit more of an overview first of the work that they do. And then secondly, the Future Generations Haiti, which is one of our country offices, will be talking about their success mapping work. So we'll be dividing the seminar roughly into two 30-minute sections on those two topics. And that's all. I've already said what I have to say about housekeeping. So we'll move on. I'm going to hand over now to Robin Barr, who's based in, well, she's based in Seattle, I think, but currently is in Brazil, and is going to provide a little bit of an overview of the Forest Trust and the work that the Forest Trust is doing. So I hope you all can see the screen. Please tell me if you can't, and I know you can't right now because I'm not in the right window again. Is that working out for everyone? This is a PDF version. The other slides will be PowerPoint. So is that working?
I don't see the slides yet.
Okay. Let's try this again. How about now?
Yes.
There we go. Yes.
Okay, great. So over to you, Robin. Thanks a lot.
Okay. So I'm going to give a general introduction to the organization that I work with. That's called the Forest Trust, or TFT. And then Vail will be sharing with you about one of the specific projects that we work on under one of our initiatives that's called Rurality. So TFT is a nonprofit organization, and we were founded in 1999. Our focus as an organization is to work with businesses on transforming their operations to be more environmentally friendly and to benefit society and people. So a lot of times we are working to make the connection between business and civil society. We have around 260 employees currently, and the majority of these employees are working in the field with companies on how to improve their operations from both social and environmental point of view. So we employ environmental and social experts, but we're also kind of unique as a nonprofit because we tend to be business minded. So we're really looking at how to develop solutions that work for companies and work for the environment and work for local communities. So we often say we're between two worlds, but in actuality, we're between about 5 or 6 or 7 different worlds in any given project. So you can go to the next slide. Usually just hit page down or, yeah. So when TFT was founded in 1999, there was a lot of companies at the retail side, well-known stores who were getting attacked by campaigning NGOs. They had campaigns against them for using illegal timber and using timber that was being harvested in a way that was very destructive to the environment. So I think the insight that our founder, Scott Poynton, really had was that if companies wanted to change that story, wanted to be able to say that they were using wood coming from well-managed forests, they needed to be able to understand their supply chains, and they needed to be able to actually map their supply chains back to the forest source, and then engage directly with the forest managers on how to improve operations. So the TFT was founded as a membership organization where companies who were committed to improving the environmental and social behaviors in their supply chains could join. They would pay a membership fee, and then with this membership fee, we help them to map their supply chain and then use the money to provide expertise and guidance and training to the companies at the base, at the forest level of their supply chain. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So this is a map of TFT's current offices. We're in 16 different countries, 17 now, because lately we've just opened an office in Ecuador and another one in Peru. But the majority, and historically, we have our largest offices in Indonesia and Malaysia. And we also have quite a large program in Central and West Africa. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So this is just an example of a diversity of skill sets of the people who work with TFT. We have agronomists, we have business experts, we have sociologists, anthropologists, supply chain experts, accountants. So it's really a mixed skill set, because we find that to solve many of the issues we're looking at solving, you need a mixture of expertise. Okay, you can go to the next. We work now, although we started out working on tropical timber and hardwoods, we now work on a variety of commodities. We're quite well known for our work on palm oil, which is one of the largest, and which Phil will be talking about. But we also work on everything from beef, pulp and paper, cacao, coffee, etc. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And I mentioned that our members are companies, and many of these companies are well-known companies like Nestle, as well as trading companies like Bunge, ADM, Cargill, as well as the production companies, which may not be household names, but which are often the ones managing the plantations or managing the forests. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So as we've done our work since 1999, we've developed a basic approach to how we work with companies on transforming their operations and transforming their supply chains. We call this the VTTV approach. It starts, the first V is for values. So it starts by helping companies to understand the environmental and social issues in their supply chains and define their values. What do they expect in terms of environmental and social performance? And to do this by creating a policy. The next step is transparency, which is about helping them to map their supply chains and to really understand what is the current practice within their supply chains in terms of environment and social. The second T is transformation. So then once you know what your values say and what your policy says, and then you know what the reality is, you have to make plans for how to reach your values. So these are action plans for transformation, for changing behavior, either within the company's own operations or also within the operations of their suppliers. And then the final V is verification. So you also have to have a system along the way to verify the progress that you're making towards the transformation. So this is the basic approach that we take with companies. When I took the seed scale course, it was quite interesting for me to think, how is this similar to like a seed scale approach with communities? But this is, if you look at the work that we're doing with companies, it's usually following this model. So that's TFT. I can turn it over to Vale now to tell you about one of our specific projects in Ghana.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Robin. I think we'll just go right over. Is that showing up? Go ahead, Vale. We've got a little background noise, but carry on.
Okay, so I'm still seeing Robin's slideshow. Do you have the other one from me as well? But in the meantime, maybe...
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, in the meantime, maybe I can just talk a little bit about the TFT initiative that we call Rurality. So as Robin just discussed, a lot of the company's original work was directly with companies. And it was based on this belief that when we have companies that make a strong commitment, that are in touch with values, core values of their company, in terms of the environmental practices they want, the social relations, the community engagement, all those factors that they want their supply chain to be part of. Once we have that commitment and we have that unified vision, then these companies are very capable of starting to make transformations that will have a huge impact on all of those aspects. It is one thing though when you're working directly with a company who has a kind of a far reach. So Robin discussed that we work a lot in palm oil right now. And typically how the palm oil sector operates is that you have large companies that have huge plantation extensions. I'm sure you guys have seen videos before. Maybe you've seen palm oil plantations in your own right. They can be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hectares of land. So when you have a company like that, it's a very top-down approach. In our work though, we are seeing that not all of the supply chain, so the supply chain is not coming just directly from these plantations. Actually, a huge amount of the oil palm that we consume in this world, that's processed in this world, is not coming from plantations at all, but rather it's coming from smallholder farmers. And these plantation companies and mills are purchasing the oil palm or palm oil from these smallholder farmers and then doing the processing. So we realized that in the palm oil sector, we had to shift our approach a little bit. When we were looking at who was going to be the driver of this change in the environmental aspects, in the community and social aspects, we saw that it won't just be these major companies, but it will also be the smallholder farmers themselves. And that's kind of what is behind the Rurality initiative and the Rurality approach. So I'm not super familiar with future generations. I have reviewed your website, talked to Robin and everything. So I thought I'll just give you a bit of a presentation of what we're doing here in Ghana and that theme, and then allow enough time where you can be asking questions about whatever aspect is interesting to you guys. So Mikey, maybe you can go to the next slide. Okay. So just a bit more background about the Rurality vision and values. We recognize that close to 2 billion people around the world live and work on small farms. Not only are these the lifeblood of supply chains, but they're the most directly tied to land. And so therefore, they actually have the greatest potential to drive change in our ecosystems and our nature and our conservation and how our communities engage in our labor rights. We do see though that oftentimes these small farmers are acting independently, they're disassociated, their relationship to large companies or to their markets or to their supply chain is attenuated or broke down. They lack the support or the connections that they really need to drive the kind of change that they want to see. So our vision with Rurality, it was to engage with smallholder farmers that are part of supply chains and the companies that are the other end of the supply chain and all the stakeholders in between, kind of bringing them together and seeing how this closer conversation, this dialogue allows them to work together more as opposed to just interacting on a market value to start driving this change. So in respect to that, we're guided by kind of 3 ideas, which is connecting farmers and key stakeholders. So connecting farmers with the company or the mill that processes their palm oil, but also with maybe government, perhaps NGOs, perhaps community leaders, that are going to support them in their actions towards conservation, towards better community relations. Oftentimes the farmers that we're working with in the oil palm supply chains also have very limited capacity in terms of their technical knowledge, maybe their access to the tools and the inputs that they need. It's kind of the story of farmers around the world, right? Where there's a lot of knowledge on practices, but there's not always access to the things they need, the correct seeds they need, the correct fertilizers, or the space to be growing what they need. So we look to strengthen farmers through capacity building with trainings, and then access to these tools or inputs that they need. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so looking towards empowering these farmers through their connections with the supply chain, we kind of approach any of our projects, which we have in Ghana, of course, which is where I'm working, but we have is in Vietnam, in Peru, kind of all around the world. There's a basic approach that we have, which comprises 3 components. So the first component being the scoping phase. And in the scoping phase, we're trying to identify a mill, a palm oil mill, which is the first step in refining palm oil. So we're identifying a mill that we can work with that has some interest in change, that has some interest in improving its environmental and social conditions and its connections with its supply chain. And also, not only the mill itself, but in the surrounding communities, we're also looking to identify communities where there is an interest in farmers and improving their livelihoods and improving their connection with the mill, improving their farming practices. So I'll describe that a little bit more, and then I'll discuss these next 2 phases that we also work on. So you can go to the next slide, please. Okay. So when we were identifying, as Robin mentioned also, we have a headquarters, or we have a main office in West Africa that's in Abidjan, Ivory Coast. But we also work in Ghana, we work in Liberia, we work in Nigeria, we work in a number of places. So when we were trying to identify a project for Rurality, we were looking for a mill that was within our supply chain, so within one of the supply chains of our clients that had this interest in improving some of its relations, and that also had a good proximity to the plantation, the mill, and the farmers. And so we identified a mill called BOP Plantations, Benzo, which is the name of the town where it's based, oil palm plantations. They are a subsidiary of a major Asian company that TFT works with. And then they also supply to another major company, chocolate company, that we buy from. So we spoke with BOP, and they were very open to change. They were, already a bit innovative in how they approach. They have good relations with their communities in general, but they recognize that they could be really strengthened. They recognize that essentially their relationship with farmers was just one of purchasing. Other than that, they don't have much contact. And they know that the potential of the farmers to be better farmers, improve their production, improve their livelihood conditions, which are not the greatest in this area. All of those they saw as having great potential, but they didn't really know where to start. So we had the volunteerism of the company, but they didn't really have the direction. So it was a great time for Rurality to come in and provide some guidance. So you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so when we identified BOP, that mill, we see that about 60%, 65% of their production of the palm oil that they use to process comes from the plantation itself. But then we see that a huge percentage, 35%, is coming from smallholder farmers in the surrounding areas. Their estimate is that they buy palm oil from about 1,000 farmers. And as I said, the relationship is only that of a buyer. So really the company didn't know if farmers were farming to their best capability. They didn't know if the conditions on farm were living up to the standards that they set for on their plantation. So they know that their laborers on plantation have wear protective equipment, that they know how to handle chemicals in a way that won't endanger their lives or the environment. They know that they have legal and responsible working hours and pay. But in terms of 35% of their production, they had no idea if the livelihoods of these farmers, if they were making enough to get by, if they had any understanding of chemical usage, if they were considering the impact of their farming practices on the environment. And it was something that they really wanted to have a better understanding of. So that was kind of the jump off point for the next phase of our approach. So you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is just to give you, it's not the greatest map, but I hope it gives you a little bit of an understanding. You'll see the central area, it says Bop Mill. I think you can see that in the patterned area. So that is the extension of the mill. It's about 7,000 hectares, I believe. And then you can see that we have these purple dots that are the surrounding communities. Those are the major villages in the surrounding area. And then we have a couple of red dots also, which are farms that Rurality has mapped. So this was the scoping part of our assessment. We'd identified the mill, we'd identified the interested villages that the company wanted to work with and that wanted to work with us as well. And so that's how we moved into the next phase of this approach. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay. So the second phase of our approach, and this is substantial, is called the Rural Dynamics Diagnostic. I think this might be interesting to you guys. So what we do in this phase is we engage with communities and we engage with farmers, and we try to build a pretty comprehensive understanding of their context. So we don't come into the project talking with the company like, okay, we'll come in and we'll do trainings for your farmers, we'll give them access to loans. We don't really offer any of that. We say we'll come in, we'll assess the context by speaking to as many farmers and communities as we can. We'll try to build a good understanding of the economic, the social, the environmental factors that these communities and these farmers deal with. And from that information, we'll develop an action plan that we can begin to implement. So that's really what this RDD phase was. We spent about, I think it was about over 8 months speaking with communities. I think you can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so we spent about 8 months with our 2 field agents that were based, they were living in the villages that they were working in and day out. I think it was 6 days a week for several months. And they would approach communities, introduce ourselves, Rurality, what we were doing, explain what we did and didn't do. So explain our connection to the company, that we weren't from the company, explain that we were a nonprofit, but that we would not be bringing fertilizers or loans or a lot of things that these farmers had been exposed to through other NGOs in the past. And then also explaining that our goal was to unite them closer with the company, improve their ability to communicate their needs, and to increase the participation and cooperation between these 2 entities. So in that time period, our 2 field agents spoke with about 207 farmers. They collected, you can see in this photo, this is essentially kind of the survey that they were collecting. So it was some hard information, what's the size of your farm, how many people are in your family, and then also a lot more qualitative information. Why do you farm? What are your dreams for your farm? What do you lack? What do you have as a vision for your children? So all of these kind of things, so that we could try to get a quite good understanding of the farmer's context in general. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So essentially, I just spoke through what that RDD process was, a lot of individual and village meetings. The idea being to receive as much information as we could, but also to build trust with the farmers and find out who was interested in cooperating with us. The program was based completely on self-selection, so there are no farmers partaking that are forced into it or have any fear that it will undermine their relationship with the company if they do or don't participate. And what we have as the outcome is we have mapping of about 163 farms. Then based on the individual data collected and on-farm visits, we begin to build these farmer profiles on the farmers' lives, and also, the status of the farm at this point in time, which we carry through as we work with them. So now we're on our second year, so we're still building these farmer profiles, so they show some growth over time. We identified leaders and stakeholders and those most interested in the project. We then stepped back to reflect on the information that we had collected, pick out different trends, and compose essentially a diagnostic report highlighting what we saw as the main challenges, opportunities, interests of the communities themselves. And then we used that information to put together a participatory action plan. So we kind of compiled the information, developed sort of an action plan where we thought we would work in the next year, spoke with the communities through their associations to introduce that plan to them, get their feedback, modified it, iterated it, and then spoke with the company, got their feedback, again moderated it, and then introduced that again to the communities, again to the company, until we had full agreement on, okay, let's go ahead with this action plan. So you can go to the next slide. And I'm conscious of time, I'm wrapping up. So some of the key findings we had, I mean, I think one thing that we didn't necessarily expect was that most of our farmers are not only farmers. At least 50% of the farmers have a non-farming source of income. 30% of them consider cocoa and not palm oil as their main source of income. We also saw, which was a huge insight for us, that the farmers, 87% of them, so the overwhelming majority, are hiring labor to do the work on farm in terms of weeding, pruning, and harvesting, since oil palm is a really labor-intensive activity. We also saw that most farmers were trying to apply chemicals and that they had a very low understanding of what were the appropriate ones, that they didn't feel comfortable in their knowledge either, and they were very, very receptive to having further information about what to use and how. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, also another key insight for us was that the farmers that we worked with, because we'd been told when we came in, oh, most of them are just doing it for money, they're not that interested, but the overwhelming feedback that we got was that they're proud of being farmers and that they want to continue being farmers. And even if they had other sources of income, they would like to continue on their farm, and they know that their farms aren't the state that they would like them at, and that they have short-term and long-term plans for improving their farm. So that gave us a huge amount of things to work with as we started to design, okay, how can Rurality support their progression based on what they want? So you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so based on all of that information and this iterative back and forth, we decided on, I think there's about 10 factors that we would really focus on, that we would develop KPIs for and start to work on in this first year, acknowledging that we might not be hitting the nail on the head or be exactly spot on with what we identified, but as a starting point. So what I thought I would do for the rest of the presentation is just introduce two of these aspects, one being the technical knowledge or training that I feel like has been quite successful in this past year where we've been implementing the action plan, and just quickly introduce another area, the labor forces, where we haven't really succeeded and we're having to kind of step back and reformulate. So you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, as I said, we identified a huge interest of the farmers in further training. We identified knowledge gaps or lacks of knowledge for chemical use, for pruning, for weeding, for all these key aspects of oil palm farming. So we began to do group trainings. Again, we co-developed the curriculum with the farmers themselves and the company. So these are kind of the rough sketches of the first iterations of the training materials that you can see in the photo. And then we also do follow-up coaching on farm. So most of the farms at this point, the 163 participating, have had at least 3 visits from our field staff. Some have had as many as 7 or 9 based on how involved they are essentially. Okay, you can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, just as I said, group trainings and individual coaching, which has had really strong feedback from the farmers, especially the individual coaching, where it's very tailored information to their context. Okay, you can go to the next slide. This, I'm not sure, this might be something of interest to you guys, but it's a bit difficult to track the success of something such as trainings. So instead of most entities that we've seen are using yield as an indicator of the farmers' adoption of farming practices. Are they producing more on the land that they have? That is one potential indicator, but we thought that it isn't super comprehensive. So what we're doing also is kind of a self-reflective process on the part of our field staff, where when they do a farm visit, they're looking at the different aspects that they train on, and they're trying to assess the farmer's both knowledge and use or application of that training on farm. And then really inquiring into why there's a difference between the two. Is it a lack of understanding of the training, or is it just inability to access the chemicals or the correct tools that they would need to be doing it themselves? Okay, and you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, just quickly, this area that we've struggled with about this past year was we identified in the RDD that the farmers have a hard time, or the farmers stated that they have a hard time finding labor, skilled labor that can do their harvesting or their pruning. And so that was a major challenge that was across the board identified. So we thought, okay, great. Rurality can play a role by helping to identify skilled laborers. The company can come in and do their part by providing them with training and maybe access to the tools that they need at subsidized prices. And we can be bringing those actors together so that they can negotiate maybe a better rate for the farmers also, and a schedule for the labor force. And we were like, oh, this is a win-win-win based on the community's needs, great. What we found out, you can go to maybe the next slide too. What we saw is that, in fact, no, we coordinated all of that, brought it all together, and we found out that, in fact, the challenge was not so much identifying labor, it was the fact that oil palm farmers aren't able to pay upfront in cash, and that's what laborers require. In fact, they pay more on a credit system where you would come and work as their laborer, and then when they brought in their harvest and got their payment out, then they could pay you. So it was a lot of time invested, and we kind of missed the mark. So right now we're at a point where we're reassessing how we can approach that. And so you can go to the final slide, maybe. And so through reflecting on where it's not making sense, and then again speaking with farmers, speaking with associations and communities, we thought that instead of working with big associations, we'll work with small groups of self-selected farmers that can appoint their own labor forces. And we can also work with one of the buying agents that can help them create kind of like a savings pool from their harvest that can pay for the labor the next year. That way it's still almost like a credit system for the farmers, but the laborers will be getting it cash in hand. So that's something that we're piloting now based on self-reflection and this iterative process. So I know that was brief. I know it was about oil palm, a sector you guys might not know very much about, but I hope maybe it gives just a little bit of insight about how we're trying to apply some of these concepts that you guys work through every day with our community involvement. So thank you, and any questions, I'm really happy to discuss any aspect of this project.
Great, thank you so much. This is excellent. I see that we have a number of comments, mostly saying thanks and how important and exciting this is. We do have a few minutes for questions. I'm working on the side here to get our Haitian colleagues connected for the second part as well. So please feel free to jump in, ask questions, and thanks again to the great presenters.
Vail, and Robin, this is Daniel. First of all, as I said in the chat, congratulations, big thanks. We need to work more closely with TFT. You guys are doing great stuff. This analytic that Vail has just run past has lots of utility and would help us. We are working very hard on in the whole rural sector in a number of countries, as are you. And so, Robin, I'm speaking especially to you because you've been our primary point of contact. An emphatic, maybe I should even say an aggressive appreciation. And let's keep finding parallels. I see our coordinator in Hanoi in Vietnam, and I know you're working in Vietnam. So Quang, I'm thrilled that you're on, and Dan Westner, who's also working in Vietnam and other places. And Dan Robinson has been working in much of these issues in the ag sector in the Amazon. Those are just some of our people that are on the line right now. The Afghan team is also working, and Fisia has expressed his interest out of Ethiopia. There's a lot we need to keep working on, Robin, and so
absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. It would be great to make those connections between TFT teams in those countries and the future generation teams in the countries as well.
Yeah, I do have a quick question. That part of the world, one of the main drivers of deforestation are small farmers doing plantation crops. Not too long ago, saw an article in Côte d'Ivoire on cocoa and cocoa farmers that are now in what used to be protected areas at Independence. So you did have, your map had a forest reserve, and there was a block in one of your maps.
Dan, we don't hear you at the moment. Hang on, I think you're muted.
Reserve.
Dan, we missed part of your comment. I think you accidentally got muted there. Can you repeat the last thing you said?
Well, did you get enough to answer my question? No.
You were talking about the map that showed the forest reserve and the deforestation in Côte d'Ivoire, but we didn't get the question.
What is your policy? You're working with small landholders. Some of them will be on their land, and others will be inside forest reserves or inside national parks. What do you do when that happens? What's your policy to work with that situation?
Yeah. Vail, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, it's really tricky here, and it's a huge issue. I mean, we work with palm oil, but especially in cocoa, it's a massive issue. And for our colleagues in Ivory Coast, that's actually kind of the starting point of one of the major projects that they have going on with again a cocoa chocolate company. So there are different policies. I think the foundation, and Robin can speak to this if she would like also a bit, but the foundation is usually working with these companies and these communities through an FPIC process, so a free, prior, and informed consent process, where you're discussing, very much what their context is, what their situation is, to be making the appropriate steps. We don't, in that actual project, we don't have any farms that are located within the national forest. We don't have any that are located on the plantation, which is lucky because that's pretty rare. In our other projects in Ghana, we do have some of that. So yeah, there's just different ways of approaching it. But I think one of the major also objectives of this project is that in working with the communities, You're also understanding which areas are of importance to them. You're also understanding and discussing preservation of forest areas. And so instead of expanding their farms, which is usually what you see when you have low productivity, okay, I'll just add some more trees. It's more a discussion of, okay, how can we take the land that you currently operate on and increase your productivity from there? There's many practices you can be doing, and we can show you example farms of where they are doing it instead of increasing outward, just kind of increasing your volume. So that's one of the approaches that we have.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that Jerome Toka, who manages our Côte d'Ivoire program, he's actually in touch with the Côte d'Ivoire government, because he wrote an op-ed in the newspaper criticizing them for forcibly kicking out people from the forest reserves. That was causing a lot of violence. And of course, afterwards, the people just go back in to revisit their farms. And so what we're proposing and in conversations right now about is, how do we work hand in hand with the farmers who are operating in the forest reserves to come up with a plan to recognize the areas that would be most important to protect, while also, you know, not completely undermining their livelihoods at the same time. So, but that's more on the drawing board than in the implementation phase at the moment. But yeah, it's a major challenge.
Other questions?
Well, unusually, oil palm is native to that area, so it's not like we're actually dealing with the native species there. So, not like a.
I didn't quite get it.
Yeah, he was just commenting on the fact that that oil palm is actually native to West Africa. So in other places where oil palm encroaches on forests, it's a foreign species, but in West Africa, it's actually a native species, which is kind of interesting.
At least.
Any other questions or comments?
Well, we still seem to be having some connectivity challenges with our team in Haiti. So we do still have, we still have time to carry on this conversation while we try to get them on with audio.
Yeah, well, I just add the comment that you guys, where you guys are talking about, is where the rubber hits the road. I mean, these are local resource users at the forest edge. So if you're going to have an impact, this is where it's happening. So, and it's not easy. That's why I asked what your overall policy was.
Well, Dan, you are growing chocolate inside of a nature preserve yourself there in Bolivia. So I assume you're really speaking from first-hand position.
No, well, my own chocolate died in nature preserve. It's actually a voluntary buffer zone. But the situation in Bolivia could not be more different from West Africa. I mean, the part of the West Africa, the population has increased something like 7 times since independence. So you have 7 times more people, and the forest is disappearing. Where I am, when we do a protected area, we actually create areas where we know people will be present, and where we desire them to be producing relative. In West Africa, it's a different situation.
They have some creative approaches out here. TFT itself, since we work with a number of different companies in a highly concentrated area, there's one area that a western region, what they call it, which has mining, it has cocoa, it has oil palm, it has rubber. I mean, it's hugely resource rich and dense, and thus hugely exploited. There's a lot of extraction there. So part of what we are doing also is exactly what you're getting at, Dan, which is looking how we can bring different actors together these major actors that are the powerful and wealthy companies, but then also the state actors, to be identifying some approaches that go beyond just military and police force, which has kind of been the approach in the past, to working with communities in support of protecting and conserving these areas. Because a lot of what you see is what they call galamsey in Ghana, which is illegal mining by small community members or people who would traditionally be small farmers. And those can end in violent clashes in areas that, yeah, are protected or are now concessions, but historically, you know, they were the land use and rights of these communities. So looking for a non-violent approach to how to bring those actors together towards resolving and protecting these areas is, yeah, it's some of the most interesting work that we do, but it's also definitely some of the most challenging, certainly.
All right, so we're having some troubles on the Haiti side. We're trying one more thing and hope to have them on here in 2 to 3 minutes. Otherwise, we may have to reschedule them for another seminar. So any concluding thoughts on this great presentation? It's I just would like to say, I guess, that it's wonderful to have some other partners and you know, sort of parallel organizations that have been really thinking about some of the same challenges and working towards some of the same goals that we are at Future Generations University. And so it's, you know, thank you all so much for coming and sharing your work and both what's working well and some of the challenges and opportunities that you see that you're, you know, continuing to collaborate with multiple stakeholders to make move forward. So really exciting, and we're looking forward to continuing this conversation and seeing if we can make some of those direct connections with some of our team that's working in the different countries where you all are as well.
Micah, this is Daniel.
Yeah.
And if Robin or Vale have a moment before the Haiti team, and maybe we, as I say, we should pick up Haiti because the success mapping there is extremely interesting, and for at least for future generations, we want to use that in other plot parts. So I'm eager not to shortchange it. But I was noted when you comment on multiple income streams, Vale, that you would focus on one sector, and then when you unpacked it, I think that this whole role of rural people having multiple income streams is actually a bias that most of us who have gone through educational training, we sort of assume that there's an escalator that comes out of the schooling that gets you a job that is your primary income stream. But people who are the traditional people that all society has come from are actually getting multiple income streams, and it's more a reflection of our bias rather than the world reality. And it's something that as researchers, we need to start by changing our perspective. And the biggest offender here is the bias that men bring towards not validating the income stream that women all over the world do, which is a multiple income stream and multiple roles that is not monetized, but is in fact the lifeblood of families. And so I guess what I would be really interested in suggesting to TFT and to future generations in some sort of partnership, as we are learning to understand rural life from the myopia of our professional lives, let us open our eyesight to the reality that the majority of the people live in, which is they're working multiple streams in order to make ends meet. And I think that most of scholarship is not doing this, and that is an opportunity for us, if we are going to be authentic in understanding the realities, that the people who really are on the frontier, Dan Robinson was just referring to it, and I think that other people, certainly all my colleagues from Afghanistan who are on this thing, they understand that on steroids.
I would just add a footnote. It's not just the income streams, it's the savings streams. So multiple family members, multiple generations have different ways to save the family. considerable expenditure. So that's as good as income.
And my feeling is that it's not just academia or people studying it, it's also in program design a lot. And if you're not taking into account these multiple work streams, even planning your approach and your projects, it's not well adapted oftentimes to the reality of people's life balance, or how they're having to, when they're able to focus time on the topic that you're bringing to them or that you're working with them about. I definitely see that in a lot of the work that we're doing here.
Yeah, similar to that, you know, I worked for quite a few years in Sulawesi working with teak farmers, and just speaking to the savings aspect, you know, the teak was planted as a form of long-term savings that could be harvested if somebody had to go to the hospital, or if they had school fees or a wedding, or, you know, a big expense of some kind. And it was really important when we engaged with the farmers to keep in mind how they were doing the teak, because definitely a lot of the buyers that we work with, their goal is to get farmers to plant as much of the product that they want to buy as possible, right? But many industries are actually finding that farmers are selling their land, not able to make ends meet, and moving to the city, and this results in a big impact in their income streams. So one of the other interesting things that Rurality is doing is helping companies to realize that farmer resilience is in their best interest, and that, you know, purely pushing plant as much oil palm as possible, or plant as much teak as possible, or plant as much cocoa, or, you know, whatever the product they want to buy is, could actually be shooting themselves in the feet if they don't really understand, you know, how these farmers are going to remain as farmers and be resilient. So I think it's definitely a really interesting area that we're looking at, this question of like farmer resilience, and how do we maintain the multiple use of income streams and support them in that.
And maybe just to follow that, sometimes with the companies that we engage with, there's a very clear understanding of that when that topic is brought up, of supporting farmer resilience is better for your company in the long run. There's direct engagement. Other times, there's not a lot of buy-in at first, but I mean, just in our project alone, we had 10 farmers uproot their palm in the past year. 10. I think 3 of them for cocoa, 3 of them for rubber, and other 2 because they simply couldn't maintain. So, I mean, when the concept isn't that translatable maybe to a for-profit company, those numbers become quite explicit for them too, which is something that, that we're using in our resiliency work.
So, Val, my name is Christy Hand. I'm the Chief Academic Officer here at Future Generations. Thank you so much for your presentation. We lived in Cameroon for 5 years, and I've got a question about the gender distribution that you worked with. It seems like in the family farmers are mostly women, it seems, but it seems that the people that you worked with in the corporations on the more corporate side of palm oil or rubber were probably mostly men. So I'm just interested in your gender experience, I guess, in your work there.
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. Just last week, a colleague of mine who spent, I think, 6 or 7 years in Cameroon and just switched to the Abidjan office, he was visiting our project, and he was constantly asking about the gender aspect. It's interesting here because in terms of farm distribution, I think we had about 40% of the farms are run by women, owned by women, not just that they operate it, but it's theirs. You'll even meet couples where the woman has her farm and the man has his farm. So there's a pretty clear distinction because it's more tribal delineation than nuclear family ownership here. But exactly what you're saying. I mean, plantation culture is male dominated. Plantation culture is older men, oftentimes in West Africa, oftentimes, you know, South African or Dutch or not Dutch, Belgian or foreign too. So it's a really interesting dynamic with that. And even for us, it's like for the trainings, you really have to take into consideration where is going to be a gender neutral area. What is going to be a gender neutral time? You know, you can't plan a training on market day. You can't plan a training even at the plantation, perhaps. It needs to be on farm, maybe on a female farmer's farm. So those are definitely things that we try to take into consideration and play into the work that we do.
Did you also take into consideration the tribal leadership structure as that when you went into a village, or because you're working with so many different structures, the corporate structure, the government structure, the tribal structure. So which did you kind of go to first as far as getting permission to go into a certain area?
Yeah, you know, in fact, and it's nice, both of our field agents are of Fanti descent, so they're both Akan peoples, and that's the communities that we're working with, so their awareness of this structure and these people is quite good. But really, I mean, we spent the full first year almost trying to go through these farmer associations, which are essentially village associations. You don't have a farmer in the Trebum Association that's from a different village, for example. And it was really, really difficult for us because the associations have a history of difficulties, and there's a lot of distrust there. They've had a lot of almost victimization by some of the NGOs that have been active in that area that kind of came in, gave some stuff and left. So we were going through that structure though, because traditionally that is the structure that we needed to go through. So it was a lot of patience on our part, saying like, okay, this probably isn't going to get anywhere, but it's how we need to do it. And at this point, I think we're very well received and well respected by the associations. And it's freeing us up now to be able to go and speak directly to groups of the farmers without undermining them, because essentially the association leaders are the tribal leaders. I mean, they're the village leaders and elders, even though it's like an appointment process.
Yeah.
So I think it's at times been frustrating, and I'm glad that as an outsider too, I had a really strong example from my boss and the full go ahead from TFT to be like, hey, take your time, don't force things, like reflect, and they'll move as they do, as long as you're being open and innovative with it. So that's been the approach.
Very impressive. Thank you. Appreciate that response.
Great. All right. Well, this has been really wonderful. Thank you, TFT, for the excellent presentation and for bringing your experience and wisdom into our conversations as well. We're looking forward to carrying those forward. And we will be talking about the success mapping in Haiti on a future seminar. So stay tuned, and thank you all for being here. And I know there are a number of folks who will be watching the recording as well. So wish you all a great rest of the day, and talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Micah.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Thanks, Nels.
Great input.
Thank you.